Welcome to the place where every whisper hides a storm, where every smile may conceal a knife, and where love and loyalty are tested in the shadows. Here, the truth doesn't walk in, it crashes through the door, shattering everything you thought you knew. These are the stories no one dares to tell, the betrayals buried deep, the secrets that rot in silence, and the revenge that brews slowly until it strikes with deadly precision. Every tale here will pull you into a world where trust is fragile, family ties are tangled, and emotions cut deeper than any blade. If you crave stories that grip your heart, twist your mind, and leave you breathless, you've found your home. Subscribe, stay close, and prepare for what comes next. The warm glow of family gatherings had always seemed unshakable. Laughter spilled across the table, glasses clinked, and the scent of familiar dishes carried memories that felt eternal. Every celebration, every shared meal, was wrapped in the comfort of knowing the people around were bound by blood and love, or so it seemed. It started subtly, almost too quietly to notice at first. He began missing dinners for reasons that felt rehearsed, late nights at work, sudden business trips, errands that dragged on for hours. The phone, once left carelessly on the counter, became an object guarded with an almost obsessive care. Notifications would light up the screen only for it to be turned over quickly, as though hiding something that couldn't risk the light. Conversations at the table shifted. Where there had once been open exchange, there were now vague replies and moments of distracted silence. His eyes, when they met hers, carried a weight, a flicker of something unreadable, as if a part of his mind was somewhere else entirely. It was easy to dismiss at first, to believe that stress or exhaustion could explain the distance, but the unease began to take root. Then came the glances, brief, almost imperceptible, but not to someone who had learned every nuance of his expression. They would pass between him and her, between the husband and the sister, as though there was an invisible thread pulling their attention to each other. It was always just long enough to stir a quiet alarm, yet short enough to avoid drawing notice from others. The kind of look that might mean nothing, unless it meant everything. At gatherings, the air grew heavier in ways no one spoke of. She noticed him leaning closer when speaking to her sister, the conversations too soft to overhear, but marked with a familiarity that didn't belong there. When he laughed at her jokes, it was warmer, longer, and with an ease that felt different from the way he laughed at anyone else's. And when the sister laughed in return, it wasn't just amusement. It was connection, a shared language spoken without words. Excuses began to align too perfectly. The sister's sudden need to leave early from one gathering coincided neatly with his abrupt calls to step outside. A last-minute errand for him was mirrored by her sudden decision to run to the store. These overlaps might have been dismissed as coincidence, but the heart knows when something isn't coincidence at all. The warmth of family gatherings, once a place of refuge, started to feel like a stage where every interaction was scripted to hide a story playing out in the shadows. Smiles became masks, conversations became distractions, and every touch or glance was weighed for hidden meaning. What once felt unshakable began to feel fragile, every shared moment cracking beneath the strain of suspicion. The house still filled with laughter, but it rang hollow, echoing against walls that now held secrets instead of safety. Each family photo taken carried a subtle distortion, a husband's arm around his wife while his eyes sought another, a sister's smile hiding the kind of closeness that didn't belong to her. The first crack in the foundation had appeared, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. It was in the way the husband's voice softened when speaking to her, in the sister's fleeting blush when he walked into the room, in the growing distance that no amount of polite small talk could bridge. The warmth that had defined family was now tinged with something else, something colder, sharper, and dangerous, and beneath it all, the truth waited, patient and merciless, knowing that sooner or later, every carefully hidden secret demands to be seen. There was a strange rhythm to his lies, something almost rehearsed, Like a melody played so often, it had become second nature. The pauses came at the same moments, the tone dipped at the same places, and certain phrases always returned, familiar lines meant to soothe suspicion, but instead they sharpened it. It was in the way he would take just a fraction too long before answering, as though constructing the perfect version of the truth before letting it fall from his lips. It became impossible not to notice the pattern. Small stories that didn't quite match the day before, details that shifted like sand. First he had been at the office late, then it was a client dinner, then it was a meeting that ran over. He never stumbled outright, never gave a reason to call him out, but it was in the space between his words that the real answers lived. Those silences weren't empty, they were heavy, and in them something dangerous waited. Late-night phone calls turned into muted conversations from another room. Doors shut softly but firmly, voices lowered until they were nothing but muffled hums. The rhythm was there too, in the way the call would end abruptly when footsteps approached, in the forced casualness of his expression when reappearing as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just the lies, it was the precision with which they were placed, as though he'd mapped out a perfect cover. The words he chose became telling. When speaking of his day, there was a new vagueness, an unwillingness to commit to specifics. The warmth in his voice dimmed when answering certain questions, replaced with a measured calm meant to discourage further curiosity. And yet, that same voice seemed to spark with a different energy when he thought no one was listening, when he was on the phone, when he spoke to someone who wasn't supposed to exist in that space. It was a game of shadows, but the pieces began to align. Small slips of the tongue, expressions that betrayed more than his words ever would. A name spoken accidentally and covered with a laugh. A moment when his phone lit up, and the name displayed froze him for just a second too long before he quickly turned it over. Patterns began to emerge beyond the conversations. Days when his mood shifted abruptly, bright and restless after certain absences, quiet and guarded after others. Times when his scent carried something unfamiliar, perfume not worn in this house. Even the way he moved seemed to change after these disappearances, lighter somehow, as though he was carrying a secret that brought him satisfaction he couldn't hide. It was the consistency of it all that betrayed him. Lies are supposed to be chaotic, messy, easy to trip over, but his were crafted with the same care as a well-worn story, and that was the problem. Real life doesn't follow a perfect script. He was too smooth, too certain. And in that perfection, the cracks became obvious. There were moments when his eyes would falter, when he'd search for a distraction to avoid meeting the gaze that could see through him. He would reach for his phone when conversation got too close to dangerous territory, scroll through meaningless screens as if to signal he was too busy for deeper questions. It was the oldest trick, and yet he played it like a man convinced it still worked. The most damning part wasn't a word he said, it was the silence that followed, long, weighted silences after a question that didn't even sound accusatory, pauses that hung between them like a confession unspoken. Those silences were louder than anything he could have admitted, because they were where the truth lived, waiting for the moment it would finally break free, and it did. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow, undeniable accumulation of proof, each pause, each glance, each carefully chosen word adding weight until the truth could no longer be hidden under the rhythm of his lies. The sisters' laughter used to carry the kind of warmth that wrapped around the heart, a familiar sound tied to years of shared memories and unshakable trust. It had been a constant at family dinners, echoing over board games, coffee conversations, and holidays filled with light. But lately it had changed. The tone was softer now, drawn out in a way that felt personal. It was no longer the laughter of shared jokes or childhood nostalgia. It was something else entirely. It began appearing in places it didn't belong. In the kitchen when he was there, even when no one else was. In hushed corners during family gatherings, just beyond the range of others' ears but never out of sight. The sound lingered longer than it should, folding into the air like a secret they thought no one noticed. And there was something about the way he looked at her when it happened, a faint smile, not the polite kind, but one that carried private meaning. At first, it was easy to dismiss as coincidence. After all, laughter was part of who she was. But then came the moments when the room would fall quiet, and she would still be smiling to herself, as if holding on to something he had said just for her. Their conversations grew shorter in public, yet the energy between them was heavier, almost charged. It wasn't about words anymore. It was about what was happening in the spaces between them. The laughter started to sound different in another way too, lower, more intimate, as though it belonged to a conversation stripped of everyone else's presence. It wasn't just amusement, it was connection. There was a softness to it, a sweetness, as if she was laughing not for the joke itself, but for the person who told it, and that person was not supposed to be him. Once, in the middle of a crowded family event, it happened again. She was pouring herself a drink. He was leaning casually against the counter, and something passed between them. A murmur, then that laughter. It was quick, barely there, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. When their eyes met afterward, it was as though they'd been caught, but neither moved, neither looked away quickly enough to erase the truth. Small gestures followed, his hand brushing against hers when passing her something, the way she would lean in slightly when he spoke, even when there was no need. Their voices, when they did speak to each other, dipped in volume as though the rest of the room didn't exist. And always it would be punctuated by that same changed laughter, quiet enough to feel stolen, loud enough to make its way into the wrong ears. It became impossible not to notice how they seemed to gravitate toward each other, even when no one was paying attention. She would find a reason to help him in the kitchen. He would find a reason to linger near her side of the table. It was all wrapped in the thin disguise of family closeness, but the disguise was wearing thin. The betrayal was not in the laughter itself, but in what it carried, defection that had no place there, familiarity that should never have existed between them. Every time it happened, it stripped away a little more of the trust that had once been absolute. The sound, once a symbol of shared joy, had become a signal of something dangerous and wrong, and then there was the night when it slipped too far. They didn't see anyone watching when he whispered something into her ear, and she laughed in that new way, her hand lightly touching his arm. The moment was brief, but it was enough. That single touch paired with that sound shattered any hope that this was just misinterpretation. What had once been a comfort now felt like a weapon, a sound that pierced deeper than words ever could. It was the proof that something had crossed a line, even if no one had dared to speak it aloud yet. A single discovery can change the way the world feels beneath your feet. One moment, life moves forward in its familiar rhythm, and the next, everything tilts and nothing stands where it once did. It happened without warning, an ordinary evening, an ordinary moment, until the phone lit up with a name that should never have been there. Curiosity was the first spark, but what followed burned through every thread of trust that had been carefully woven over the years. The messages weren't just friendly. They were filled with words meant to be hidden, words dipped in intimacy, heavy with longing, lines about missing each other, about stolen moments that couldn't come soon enough. There was a rhythm to them, a comfort that only comes from repeated confessions, from a connection that has grown too deep to disguise, and the name attached to them made the air feel thin, impossible to breathe in. Scrolling felt like walking through a battlefield after the fight. Every message a piece of shrapnel lodged deep. Every exchange a reminder that what had been sacred was now shared with someone else. Meetings disguised as errands. Dinners claimed as business obligations. Each one matched perfectly with a message confirming where they would be, at what time, and what would happen when they met. The words were intimate but calculated, the kind of affection that belongs to two people who have grown used to hiding in plain sight. There were references to things they had done together, to private jokes that didn't belong to the life they pretended to live in front of others. Even in the absence of explicit confessions, the truth was there threaded through every line, undeniable in its meaning. The dates and times painted a perfect picture. Nights when he was working late, aligned with evenings she had been visiting friends or running errands. Entire weekends shifted under the weight of new understanding. What once seemed harmless coincidence now stood exposed as deliberate coordination. There were photographs too not scandalous in the way the mind first fears, but intimate in the way only lovers can be. A coffee cup pushed toward her across a table, her hand barely visible in the corner of the frame, fingers curled around his. A reflection in a window, two figures leaning close enough for their foreheads to touch. Each image was harmless to the untrained eye, but together they told a story that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just the betrayal of the act, it was the betrayal of the history. Every word exchanged in those messages, every meeting arranged, was a theft from the life that had been built with trust. A love had been growing there, not in the open light where it could be confronted, but in the dark, under the shelter of loyalty that had been taken for granted. The reality settled in with a quiet cruelty. This hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a single moment of weakness. This was deliberate. This was nurtured. This was a bond that had been fed in secrecy until it had its own pulse, its own heartbeat, strong enough to exist in the shadows without fear of being discovered. The worst part wasn't the act itself. It was how close it had lived to home. How many times had they stood in the same room, speaking in voices meant to sound casual, while this truth pulsed between them? How many family moments had been tainted by glances that carried meanings invisible to everyone else? And yet there it all was, in plain sight now, words, images, dates, all aligning too perfectly to leave room for doubt. It was the kind of truth that couldn't be unlearned, the kind that changes the way every memory is remembered. Because once the evidence is there, once the shadows reveal what's been hiding inside them, nothing about the past feels the same again. Betrayal doesn't end the moment the truth is uncovered. It seeps backward, poisoning everything that came before it. The day the lies became undeniable was not just the day the present collapsed. It was the day the past was stolen too. Every shared smile, every whispered promise, every quiet night that once felt safe was pulled apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable. Memories that had once been treasures became weapons. A dinner that had seemed like a celebration now carried the weight of knowing he had already given pieces of himself to someone else. A trip once remembered for its laughter now became a question. Was he texting her while pretending to take in the view? A kiss captured in a photograph no longer felt like love, but like a performance for an audience that wasn't even there. It was impossible to stop the rewinding. Every conversation was replayed in a new voice, one that questioned the pauses, the glances, the odd moments of distraction. There was no longer a before and after. There was only a before that had been rewritten without consent. The love that once anchored everything now felt counterfeit, and the foundation that had seemed unshakable revealed itself as nothing more than sand. Even the most mundane moments became suspect. Late nights watching a movie together. Was he thinking of her then? The way he reached for a hand while walking through a crowd, had that same gesture been offered to her in secret, the mind became a relentless investigator, searching every memory for signs that had once been invisible but now stood in sharp relief. The cruelest part was how the lies infected the good moments just as deeply as the bad. The memories that once brought comfort were now the most painful because they carried the deepest deception. The realization that joy had been shared with someone who was already dividing, that joy with another was a wound that bled every time those moments surfaced. Friends and family spoke of the past with warmth, unaware of the shadow hanging over it. Photographs were still displayed in their homes, unaware that behind those captured smiles lived a truth that would burn anyone who touched it. And while they could still see those moments for what they once seemed to be, there was no way to go back to seeing them the same way. The betrayal reached further than the act itself. It rewrote the story of a life. It altered the narrative of every year, every season, every memory that had been thought to belong to two people alone. Instead of a shared journey, it became a series of intersections where another shadow had always been present, even when it wasn't seen. And once that shadow is known, it's impossible to forget. The past doesn't fade into soft nostalgia. It sharpens into something jagged, ready to cut every time it's touched. What was once a history filled with love becomes an archive of evidence, proof of how easily loyalty can be dressed up as devotion, how convincing a lie can look when it's built into the fabric of everyday life. The hardest part wasn't letting go of the future that had been imagined. It was grieving the past that never truly existed, because when betrayal comes, it doesn't just take away what lies ahead. It steals what's behind, erasing the comfort of old memories and replacing them with a question that can never be answered. Was any of it real? Revenge, when it comes, doesn't always announce itself with shouting or chaos. Sometimes it's a slow, deliberate dismantling, like pulling at the first loose thread until the entire fabric unravels. The strength of it lies in its quietness, in letting those who built their lives on lies believe they're still safe, still in control, while every step is calculated to strip that illusion away. There was no need for confrontation at the start. Silence worked better. Silence gave room to observe, to measure every movement, every word, every glance exchanged between them. In that stillness, their confidence grew, and so did their mistakes. Every lie they thought had been buried deeper than suspicion became easier to trace. The small signs they dismissed as invisible began to pile up, forming a map that led straight to the truth they had been so desperate to protect. It began with patience, keeping the routine unchanged, acting as though nothing had shifted, while carefully collecting what was needed. Messages were copied, photographs saved, dates and times aligned until there was no space left for denial. Every piece of evidence was tucked away quietly, where it could grow in weight until it became undeniable. There was a strange satisfaction in watching them carry on, as if their secret was untouched. They smiled at gatherings, exchanged their coded glances, laughed softly in ways they thought no one noticed. All the while, the ground beneath them was being pulled away, inch by inch. They didn't feel it at first, not until the cracks began to show in places they hadn't thought to guard. The plan didn't require rage, it required precision. A conversation repeated to the right person here. A question asked at just the right moment there. Each action small enough to seem harmless on its own, yet each one loosening another piece of their carefully built facade. People began to notice the little things, changes in tone, in body language, in the way their stories no longer fit together perfectly. And still, nothing was said outright. That was the point. Let them turn on each other. Let them wonder how much the other had revealed, or what had slipped through unnoticed. Secrets thrive in silence, but they rot in suspicion. The unraveling was gradual, but unstoppable. Invitations they once received stopped coming. Friends who used to greet them warmly began to keep their distance. The sister's smile became tighter, his voice more defensive, as if they were both bracing for something they couldn't quite name, but could feel drawing closer. When the final step came, it wasn't in the form of a dramatic exposure. It was a simple, undeniable reveal, delivered in a way that left no room for arguments, no chance for them to twist the story. The evidence spoke for itself, laid out with precision, a timeline so exact that even their lies would collapse under the weight of it. There was no shouting, no screaming. only the quiet satisfaction of watching their faces as the reality settled in, as they realized the walls they had built around their secret had been dismantled piece by piece without them ever noticing. That's the thing about revenge. It doesn't always have to be loud to be devastating. Sometimes the silence speaks louder than anything else ever could. If this story shook you, there's more waiting to be uncovered. Like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next truth they tried to bury.